And I saw a lot of you at the reception last night. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, so we have a panel this morning where we're going to be talking about a very important topic, not just here for British Columbia, but really for the world. We're going to be talking about climate change. We're going to be looking at it from a perspective, from an academic standpoint, from a practitioner standpoint, from a governmental standpoint, and seeing what we, as geotechnical engineers in the room, how can we be a part of this conversation, but more importantly, how can we be a part of the solution? Because we got one planet, we got one world, and as we're seeing from a climate change standpoint and a resiliency standpoint, we got some work to do. So joined here by a panel, I'm Jared Green, I'm a GI governor here. I'm gonna let each of the panelists give you an introduction of who they are, just so you get a better flavor of who is here, and then we'll be having questions for the next 50 minutes. Unfortunately, we will not be taking any questions from the audience, but hopefully what we have here is going to provide you value as you go back to your respective places. So I'll let each of them introduce themselves.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Gaib with the BC Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. I'm an engineering director. My background is in geotechnical engineering. And over my career, I've seen the impacts of climate change, doing response to a lot of the events. I remember as a young engineer going out to my first event on the Sea to Sky Highway up to Whistler, and it was very exciting. But over my career, I've seen the frequency of these events increase substantially, and the impact as well. So as an owner, we struggle to find the resources, the people, the funding to deal with this unplanned work. So, you know, it's quite a challenge to figure out the best path forward, how to be proactive instead of reactive.
Wendy?
Good morning. My name's Wendy Mathieson, and I'm a geotechnical engineer with Shannon and Wilson. One of the many things that I do is Arctic engineering in Alaska. A lot of the projects that I work on there are for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a 800 mile long pipeline that extends from the northern part of Alaska down to the coast in Valdez, and crosses a lot of permafrost. And we see the impacts of climate change on that with permafrost thaw, and so we have been monitoring ground temperatures, air temperatures, slope movement, groundwater pressures, and above ground structure movement over the past couple of decades for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And we're using that data to evaluate how the changes in temperature, air temperatures, and ground temperatures are affecting slope movement and structure movement, and then how we can develop solutions to adapt to this changing environment that we have. And it's an interesting challenge, one that I enjoy. Anyway.
Thank you.
Good morning. I am Shawn Wilson. I only wish I was the Wilson and Shannon and Wilson, but that is not the case. I am the non-techie on the stage today. My background is policy, and I recently spent 7.5 years as Secretary for the Department of Transportation and Development in this state called Louisiana. It's probably synonymous with the disaster that you would have seen over the last few years. I will tell you the climate really changed when I became secretary. I'd been chief of staff for 10 years. Not only did the climate change politically, but things had really hit a boiling point. The day we took over, the Mississippi River was the highest it has ever been. And if you know anything about Louisiana, we have levees, and there's this thing overtopping the levees because everything is much lower than the levees. And so not only did we have that reality to deal with, over the course of my 7.5 years, we had over 25 federally declared disasters. You name it, we had it in Louisiana: floods, ice storms, tornadoes, hurricanes. We even had earthquakes. All of those things, while in different levels, the one thing I can tell you is things are weirder, wetter, wilder, and warmer. And in Louisiana, because of the politics and the climate of our politics, we couldn't say climate change when it started in 2016. It was a non-issue. We could not say it. We had a Democratic governor, and we were the only blue spot in all of the SEC Southeast. And so things had changed. And believe it or not, we were the only state when I left that had a climate action plan that was adopted at the end of those 7.5 years. It was actually adopted in year 5, and we began implementing it. And so I'll be able to bring to the table some policy implications of what it means to deal with climate change in government, and value the wisdom and knowledge and intellect of research, as well as the applied work that you do as industry. So I'm looking forward to this morning's conversation.
Thank you.
And good morning. I'm Carlos Santamarina. I work at Georgia Tech in Atlanta. I think I represent here not only the academic sector, but also I come from the energy sector. And let me give you some good news and bad news. Right now, we depend 85% on fossil fuels, and the transition out of fossil fuels has to be fueled by fossil fuels. So the situation is going to get worse before it gets better. Net zero is utopia by 2050. In fact, we are going to be emitting more CO2 than we have ever had. I'm not apocalyptic, but I think that we need to recognize that as we move forward as a profession. How are we going to confront all these wonderful projects that you've been listening? And I think that is my frame of reference.
All right, the stage has been set. I don't know about you all, but I'm kind of scared, right? Hopefully we'll feel a little better, and if not, we'll be fired up to know what we have to do. So let's start here. We'll start home where we are here. From a climate change standpoint in British Columbia, what are some of the biggest challenges? And for the avid readers out there, you may remember Geostrata last year. There was a cover article that covered some of these, but what are some of the biggest things?
Well, I'll start with speaking about the biggest event that we've had to deal with as a ministry, and that was the 2021 November event that had 3 atmospheric rivers roll through the Lower Mainland. And the 3 corridors in and out of the Lower Mainland were severely impacted. At times, they were all closed. We had to prioritize movement of goods. It restricted the movement of people. At the same time, the only option to go around was to go through the States.
Wow.
And we had the pandemic. People didn't have a passport. They weren't vaccinated. So, I mean, it was a compounding event. It was the biggest we've seen. As a practitioner, as an owner, I want to be able to make informed decisions about how to respond, how to invest my money. As a practitioner doing the work, the biggest challenge is how we work through the design, how we incorporate climate change into our design. And our ministry was very lucky that almost 20 years ago, we had a chief engineer he had the foresight to recognize that this was coming. And he started working with Engineers Canada as far back as 2008, and we did some risk assessments of our corridors. And in 2015, we developed policy that required engineering adaptation for climate change and extreme weather events, incorporating climate projections and risk analysis. That policy, it was updated in 29, and unfortunately, we haven't seen great uptake on it because practitioners are challenged with what climate data to use, how to do the risk assessment, how to incorporate this into their design. And so as an owner, we've really struggled with the climate data. What models do we use? What assumptions do we make about GHGs? Once we've settled on a model, do you use average values, mean values? There seems to be some confidence in the outputs over the short term, but the longer term, looking at 2100, we tend to lose the confidence in those values. And then getting back to the design methodologies, slope stability for an example, I've heard many practitioners say, I don't know how to do it, so we're just not going to do it. There's no standards, there's limited guidance. One of the projects that I'm currently working on right now, the Caribou Road Recoveries Projects, it's an area in the center of the province that over 2020, 2021, we saw a period of prolonged wetness, and it resulted in slides and washouts at over 300 sites. So now we have a program that the intention of it is to find a solution at 10 sites. We call it the Big 10. So, and we have federal funding to support this. And the approach we've taken here is to come up with project-specific climate change criteria. We've defined the climate data to use, the risk assessment, and we've defined methodologies specifically for them to do slope stability. And it's been quite a challenge working with our designers, working with experts. It's not perfect, but we're using what we have. We're finding a path forward, we're making an assessment, and then I, as an owner, can make an informed decision. So we're making progress, but it has been slow.
Wow. Sounds like you have your hands full. There's a lot going on. Thank you for that. Wendy, what are you seeing on the permafrost standpoint? What are some things that we need to be aware of? My daughter tells me not to use plastic, so we don't use plastic in the house. And she talks about the polar bears, so help me to have some things to talk about when I go back home. But on a permafrost standpoint, what are the biggest challenges you're seeing?
Well, so the permafrost, it's thawing, and that's what the data is showing us. We've been collecting a lot of it, and so that leads us to a lot of different challenges. And one thing that we see is unstable slopes, and I guess as Sarah mentioned, there's not really a good code, but there are ways to evaluate it. So it's not necessarily just an issue of strength. It's a matter of creep and temperature. So permafrost tends to creep, and so the warmer it is, the faster it creeps. And so that's something you have to figure out. And I think as Jocelyn brought up yesterday, previous practice was always, permafrost, you keep it cold, you keep it frozen. But now, is that what we want to do anymore? And that's maybe in some cases for some situations with slopes. In other cases, it may not be the right thing to do. But we also have situations where you have loose sands and gravels that were previously frozen and now are thawing or have thawed, and now they're potentially liquefiable. And they're so you have to design for that situation, either that it is liquefiable now or that it is going to be in the future. We also have issues with settlement, particular problem with existing structures, with ice-rich soils that have thawed or are thawing. Along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, we have the pipeline is where it's above ground is supported on 2 vertical support members, which are basically just 2 pipe piles with a cross beam, and there are locations where massive ice is thawing, and the piles are just settling feet, and so we have to come up with ways to manage that. We're seeing accelerated thawing where wildfires have come through. There's one location along the Trans-Alaska Pipeline where a wildfire came through a few years ago, and so Alyeska went out and installed a bunch of thermistor strings to measure the ground temperatures at different locations so they could look at different rates of thawing where the tundra had been burned away and out in an area where the tundra had not been burned away. Basically to just plan for the future. It's not a problem for them yet, but it's ice-rich soil there, and they know that there's potentially some challenges in the future.
Thank you. And I'd like to believe that if there are challenges, that means there's opportunities, but,
Yep.
but that's a big challenge. Dr. Wilson, so given your recent history, I understand you've been at WSP for a few weeks, right?
Two whole weeks at WSP.
Two whole weeks. So you got to go back into the past.
I think I'm the newest WSP employee here. I saw a bunch of them yesterday.
I love it. So given your recent history as CEO of Louisiana's DOTD and also as AASHTO past president, climate change has impacted the way of life for Louisiana, clearly, and you alluded to that. What are some lessons you could share for us from a governmental standpoint of how you respond to these global catastrophes?
Yeah, great question. The response cannot be slow, and government has typically been, by design, a slow process. And some of the lessons that we've learned is governments all across this country aren't prepared to meet the financial obligations necessary to really address climate change. And so in order to be sustainable when something breaks, we want to not have to go back and fix it a second time when it breaks. And so I can point to projects all across Louisiana where we know we've had repeat flooding or we've had horrible soil conditions. I mean, we started on gumbo soil, so it's not much to begin with, but in places where we didn't build it with the end in mind. And so while no infrastructure is ever going to be perpetual, you can build it in a way that's going to sustain itself. And in Louisiana, we've got the 4th largest bridge deck area in the country, which means we've got to spend a lot more time figuring out how to be thoughtful in rebuilding the system that we have. And as Carlos said, we're going to be dependent upon fossil fuels for a long time to lead this transition. In Louisiana, that's our bread and butter. And so we've had the issue of making policy decisions that make sense. One, that are politically acceptable, but two, that are financially achievable. And that's where research comes in. And so when you think about research in terms of low carbon concrete, how do you then transition your industry to build this low carbon concrete in an affordable way? Well, that's when my job kicks in, talking to the legislature to say, hey, fund these types of projects. Give me the resources to be able to invest. And it's going to have to be dynamic. When you look at the bipartisan infrastructure law, the intent, I think, of what President Biden brought about was an opportunity to move the needle on all fronts, on what we build, on electrification, on research, when you complement that with the Inflation Reduction Act, just a number of policies that are going to force states to be more thoughtful. And as a CEO, most states recognize that we don't do it alone. We rely on the private sector, the WSPs of the world, all of the competitors we have to do the work with us and for us. And so you all in the private sector have an opportunity to help move the needle, not just in terms of the technology and the work that has to be done. Those in academia have an opportunity to move the needle, not just in terms of the research and understanding the why and the how better to do something, but the idea that both of those institutions get to influence policymakers. And all of the things you hear from the technical side are super important. But the folks that are going to be pushing the red or the green button in the legislature that's going to fund those things probably won't appreciate it for the same reasons. And one of the things that Governor Edwards and I talked about is the benefit of bringing in the industrial sector to help us adopt a climate action plan, as well as embracing the environmental community to help us adopt a climate action plan. And they're doing it for totally different reasons. One's doing it for a bottom line, the other's doing it for a sustainable environment and being better stewards of the earth that we've been given. As a policy guy, I could care less why they're doing it, as long as we can work together and do it. And that's where the academics and the implied industrial work that you're going to do in the private sector will help us make those better decisions. And so those are lessons that I value, that I've learned, is we've got to act quickly. We've got to find a way to pay for what it is we want to do. And we have to collectively work to not be so partisan and so anti-intellectual to ignore science and not repeat it in a way that's going to make us much more effective. And I'll harken back to where I started. In 2016, we couldn't say climate change in Louisiana and expect to survive politically. The idea that you can have an open conversation about it in the private sector, in academia, as well as in government, shows progress, but we've got a lot of work to do ahead of time. And so those are the top three things. Affordable, it's got to happen quicker, and we've got to figure out a way to agree on what needs to be done and adopt a real science-based approach to making better decisions in government for our citizens.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Santamarina, how did we get here? I mean, from a geotechnical standpoint, how did we get here?
Okay, that's a good one. It all depends how far we want to go. Let's see. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old.
All the way to the beginning.
All the way to the beginning. Well, honestly, we've been accumulating solar energy in the form of coal, petroleum, and gas for 500 million years. Imagine Jurassic Park. That was a big peak of capturing. So coal, gas, and petroleum are a chemical battery of solar energy. Amazing, eh? We have to continue relying on the sun. And it took 500 million years, or almost 1 billion years, to bring the CO2 from the atmosphere down. Thanks to bioactivity, we capture the CO2 and we bury it and release the oxygen to create this amazing environment that we live in. And now, in the last, let's say, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been reversing the process very fast, right? Not all of it. Good part of the carbon is capturing carbonates. They are there, except when we make Portland cement. That's another big producer of CO2, and we civil engineers and society depends on reinforced concrete and then Portland cement. And so that is where we stand, and then we look at, so this is the peak that came in the last 200 years, and then we look at the society and the infrastructure we developed, particularly in North America during the 20th century. And we are very smart. We optimize for the conditions that we are given, right? The technical, economical conditions. And so we built North America with cheap oil and without the constraints of climate change. And now we are stuck with huge assets, our cities, in very open cities, not like the European cities. They develop in a different financial, technical context. And so, for example, in Atlanta, we drive every day the distance from the Earth to the sun. That's a long distance, folks. And all the assets are so distributed, spread out around the urban sprawl and around our cities, that would be very costly to reverse. And so now as engineers, we are challenged to decide how are we going to create new living conditions with these assets while still being climate conscious. And so that's the challenge that we have. 90% of transportation is based on fossil fuels, on oil, on petroleum. We need a revolution in the transportation system to continue driving the distances that we drive, with the low efficiency vehicles that we do, with 1 person per car instead of 5. That is totally unsustainable. That has to change. So these are the transformations that we see coming up, right? And then it's interesting to listen to our colleagues here. For example, here in the northern states and in Canada, we are going to begin seeing cycles that we didn't see before, the freeze-thaw cycles that did not affect before. Freeze-thaw cycles are very destabilizing for foundations, for slopes, exactly what we heard. And then Shawn was telling us a couple of times already the importance of moving fast. If you go back to see the Paris Agreement, that we are still signatories. We went on and off in 2020, but the goal was to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by the year 2030. This is completely out of the picture. We are going to increase carbon emission by the year 2030. And so what Shawn is insisting that we act rapidly is so critical. Probably for most of us, the impact won't be there, but for the younger generation, folks, you will be at the peak of your professional careers when this is going to be fairly messy, and for our grandchildren, I think that we all have to really listen to Shawn. We need to act thoughtfully and fast.
Agreed. Coming back to this side of the stage here, Sarah, how do you prioritize the upgrade of assets? Because in your position, there were a lot of things that had to be done all at the same time. How do you figure out what's priority? Like, how do you do that?
Well, to start, we're lucky that we do have funding. It was actually our provincial budget last week, and so our ministry does have a pot of money to proactively upgrade some of our infrastructure. But we're a very large province. We have over 50,000 kilometers of road, almost 4,000 structures, and over 200,000 small culverts spread across the province in diverse climates and terrains. Some of these assets are vulnerable and some of them aren't. During the 2021 atmospheric river event, we had this bridge on a very critical route and it collapsed. The original bridge was 83 meters long. The replacement structure we built to 155 meters. Does this level and associated cost of resiliency make sense for every project? So we don't have the resources to upgrade every asset to the highest standard and to address every hazard, both currently and in the future. So we need to understand the relative criticality of all our assets in order to evaluate and prioritize how we spend our funding, with the goal of increasing the resilience of a whole system. So we're looking to others, such as the Colorado Department of Transportation and the work that they have done over the past decade to increase the resilience of their system. So we're looking to do a criticality assessment of highway segments, looking at factors such as traffic volumes, highway classification, tourism value, goods movement, climate change factors. And over those same segments, looking at a risk and vulnerability assessment for all of our assets. Then we'll be able to understand what the risk and the threats for that segment is. So then combined, we can use them as a system to create a level of resilience over our highway system. So we have money and we want to target it in an impactful way, and we're looking for balanced solutions. As an example, I got a call last week from somebody working in a district. They have a stretch of road with 10 culverts that are nearing end of life, and he has some funding available to do a fix. He can upgrade 2 culverts to the full extent of climate change, or he can replace all 10 culverts. And the question was, what should I do? And I think most of us would agree, let's replace all 10 and make it better.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Let's see, so Wendy, as it relates to permafrost, you talked about this a little bit, the information. What information is necessary in order to make the appropriate recommendations, and how do you get that information?
Sure. Yeah, so it's really important for us to have good information about temperature history, ground temperature, air temperature, also any other information that's related to the problem. For a lot of the projects I work with, it's a slope stability issue. So slope movement and slope movement over time and related to weather changes, precipitation, groundwater pressures. So if owners are willing to invest in the monitoring over time, installing the instrumentation. That's really helpful. And you need not just a couple months worth of data. You need years worth of data. And then another important piece is the climate projections, which there's a lot out there. They're all wrong, sorry. But I don't mean that as an insult. It's just that there's so much uncertainty and so many unknowns that it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. So we work with what's available. One of the ones that we work with commonly in Alaska is from the Alaska SNAP, and I forget what that is, from UAF, and that's a resource that we frequently use, but even that is, it's a projection. And then another thing that's really helpful is laboratory testing on frozen soil. And usually we need to go to university to do that. University of Alaska in Fairbanks, we work with them a lot. Professor Bray there has a laboratory, and they can do they've done some great testing, triaxial testing at different temperatures, which will triaxial and creep testing, which really helps with the slope stability, because as I mentioned, it's a function of temperature. Strength is a function of temperature, and it's also a matter of creep. So a lot of times what we want to do is design to get to a certain temperature if what we want to do is keep it cold. So.
Got it. Thank you. Shawn, what role has industry and academia played in supporting Louisiana's response to the climate crisis? And then also, what guidance would you share for assisting how we could be more responsive?
Sure. I go back to 2016, and the biggest, most transformative disaster that we had in Louisiana had nothing to do with a tornado or a hurricane. It was two rain events, unnamed storms, where we had a 500-year flood in March and then a 1,000-year flood 2 months later. And it transformed what we needed to do. And so we had the political courage as a state to say, let's go back to the basics and do watershed development and management. The reality was state government, my agency, the last time we had a public works master plan for water and watersheds, we were about 12,000 people. Now we were 4,200 people, and we had more work to do than we did back in the beginnings of time when we first created our agency. And as a result, we had to rely on the private sector, both from establishing models to helping direct those plans and implement, but we also had to use research at the university system through our Transportation Research Center to help guide what that was and figure out a way to adopt a model that can be sustained, because we gotten ourselves in that position because we didn't update those plans, we didn't manage those plans. And so we saw an opportunity to really take advantage of the private sector's ability to help us grow to scale. And that's something to think about in terms of how states respond, because all states are created unequal in terms of their resources, in terms of their challenges, in terms of how they're organized and how they can respond. And so no two states are going to be alike. And so we all have to augment who we are and what we are with the private sector. And the speed at which you deliver has to be important. Now, the challenge, if you're in a corporate environment, you're dealing with workforce challenges no different than state governments are. And so who's going to do the work? We have to take advantage of technology, have to take advantage of AI and other types of resources to help us make better decisions in a faster, safer, smarter environment than what we did before. And so no longer can you do the longhand work. You've got to be a little bit more thoughtful and technological. And then on the research side, I think it's important for us to not just do the theoretical stuff. It's important to be applied. It's important to bring things from an idea stage to a research stage to market to try and reap benefits sooner rather than later. Otherwise, our constituents, the people we serve, aren't going to be satisfied and will continue to be at risk. All of that's going to work together to help us better plan for land use management, better transportation planning in terms of investing into transit as opposed to just building interstates and building highways. And so the private sector, I think, has to be important. It has to play an important role to help us move that political needle. Now, this is the political side. Faculty typically aren't paid enough to influence elections and outcomes. State government certainly wasn't in a position to help influence that. The private sector is in a much better position to help influence that. And so I look at that climate action plan we have and say we have a governor who may not always believe in science. The fact that we've got 50,000 miles of pipeline, that we are well poised to invest and grow in carbon capture and sequestration makes sense for us to do that. But we need the vocal community of people who understand these issues and understand the solutions to speak up and not just be the third person in the room who's going to have a political agenda. It's important for people who understand the why to speak up. And that's another role I think that the private sector has been able to help us with in Louisiana, where the other two sides, other two sticks in the stool or legs on the stool could not necessarily have that same level of influence. And I think collectively, that working together is going to help sustain a model as well as move something forward for us to be thoughtful in terms of how we build a more sustainable government as it relates to responding to climate change.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's see. Carlos, talk a little bit about the link between quality of life, energy, and climate. Like, how does that all dovetail together?
Yep. All these aspects are so interrelated that it's difficult to try to address one without addressing the other one, right? And so, for example, and I will go back to your question, but just to connect to Louisiana, imagine New Orleans is settling, naturally settling, probably by the end of the century will be another meter lower. Yep. And in the meantime, the sea level rise is going to bring it 1 meter higher. And so forget about Katrina, just under standard steady state conditions, New Orleans is in trouble. And so are a large number of cities, start with Miami and parts of Seattle. The coastal cities are going to be facing significant infrastructure changes because of this climate change. And then comes the water issue. And the water issue, New Orleans was taking tankers with water because of salt water intrusion. Mm-hmm. It's such an interconnectedness of all these problems. The water issue in the whole US, we think that we are blessed with water, but actually we are in big trouble. You don't have to be in Phoenix. Pretty much all over the country is a major challenge as we look into the future. So as we see, all these issues are related to quality of life. Now, if we gain some perspective and we look at it worldwide, quality of life is 100% correlated with energy consumption. And so then you see African countries and some of Latin America where the energy consumption is very low and the quality of life is very low. People don't live to make it to 50. And then we see the high energy consumption countries have very good quality of life. The good news is that quality of life is improving around the world. The bad news is that it's improving at the expense of consuming more energy. And that is something that we have to break. We have to maintain our quality of life and consume less, and we have to improve the developing nations, help them improve their quality of life without doing it at the expense of consuming more energy, because otherwise there is a compounded effect with population growth that things are going to exacerbate, right? Compounded effects. By the way, talking about population growth, you hear a lot about the number of children in different countries. That is one of the best news we have. Most countries around the world are already pointing or have already hit the 2.1 children per woman, which is the number that is needed to maintain population, except in African countries, but that one is really going down very fast. The bad news is that we're still going to hit 11 billion by the end of the this century. And so things are going to get better next century.
So I've got
Doomsday on this end. I'm
Yeah, right.
telling
I
you.
wanted to be positive.
So I've got 3 minutes on my clock. We're going to have closing statements. And because you end on doomsday, we're going to start with you and then come this way.
Okay.
But under a minute, what do you want from the GI audience? What can we do to
From the GI
be part of the
audience.
solution?
Yeah.
Under a minute.
Folks, I think that the technical solutions are there. We know the problems. We need to get involved. We have great people in politics, but let's face it, there are only 1 or 2 between Congress and Senate that are engineers, only 1 or 2. Everybody else has a law degree. And I think that we are trained to be problem solvers. We have to get involved. Politicians are very smart. We have to vote, and we have to put the right message out there for the actions to take place. I think that the main message is, let's get involved.
Excellent. Thank you. Shawn?
That was the most positive thing you said all day. Just kidding. So very similar. I think the solution to all of our problems is people. And I think from a workforce standpoint, my advice to this audience is keep doing what you're doing. And I say that because at this meeting, when I look out in this audience, I see the most diverse population I've seen in a long time at these type of technical meetings, not just in terms of cultural diversities, but also in terms of age. When I look back at the public works industry in Louisiana and community, everybody is 60 plus, and no one is coming up in that space. And there's institutional knowledge that they can bring to the table and transition to a younger generation, but there's not a younger generation there. And so I encourage you to continue doing what you're doing from a workforce standpoint by mentoring and training and valuing young academic, intellectual practitioners to come into the industry of engineering to help us solve problems. Because you're going to be more thoughtful, you're going to embrace the data and the science in a way that those who are there today may not always do it, because you have much more ahead of you than behind you, and we've got much more behind us than ahead of us. And so it's important to be a part of that solution, not just in terms of the private sector, but also in government. Also working as a young engineer in government, solving these problems and developing the relationships to be practical and implement faster, smarter, and more sustainably going forward. So I congratulate the young folks for being in this room and being a partner at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning when they could have been out much later than that last night.
Thank you so much.
Very well said.
Wendy?
Yeah, I guess for me, I would encourage other people who are working in areas with permafrost and to share some of the things that they're working on. And I have attended, conferences recently, and it feels like there's not enough being shared about practical applications and a lot of academic stuff, which is interesting to some extent, but it's good to hear. I mean, we have real world problems to deal with, slope stability, and it's beneficial to the community to hear what people are doing.
Excellent. Thank you. We started in British Columbia. We're finishing in British Columbia.
Doomsday, I'd like to think I'm the optimist over at the
No, please. I am an optimist.
She has funding. She has funding, right?
Exactly. I have a policy.
Yeah, she's got money.
I have funding. I have a policy that helps define the framework for doing the design, and I have support to get this done. And I'm looking to the private industry, to academia, to come with ideas, to talk about the challenges and to collaborate and to find a path forward. And I think it's been slow, but we're on the right path.
Excellent. Well, please help me in saying thank you to our panelists.